today. Now, Lloyd will present his paper.
Okay, thank you very much indeed for those very kind words, Sophie, and thank you to you and to Guillaume for the invitation to present in the seminar today. I'm very happy to be able to talk on the topic of Saruq al-Hadid, and in particular today I'm going to focus on the cultic aspect of the site, a difficult aspect of its interpretation, but an important one, I think. I hope you can all hear me and see my screen properly. Please let me know if you can't. So in the talk today, I'm going to be doing a few things. Firstly, I'll give a general background and introduction to Saruq al-Hadid, focusing on the history of occupation of the site over many millennia. Then I'll take a sort of deep dive and focus down into the cultic elements of the site, or those that we might interpret as cultic, whatever that may mean. And then I'm going to try and contextualize Saruq al-Hadid in relation to other early Iron Age cultic sites in Southeastern Arabia. So that's pretty much the structure of the talk today. So the site we're talking about, Saruq al-Hadid, is located in the southern part of Dubai Emirate, just in the northern parts of the Rub al Khali, the empty quarter. You'll get more of a sense of the site if I show you this picture. It's in the rolling dunes, mobile dune fields of the northern part of the Rub al Khali. A site that perhaps was not expected to be in this kind of a location where we might have not have expected this kind of site. It was discovered 20 years ago now in 2002 by the ruler of Dubai during travel through the region, and it was very distinctive due to this dark crust of metallurgical slag which was present on the surface of the site. After archaeological inspection, it pretty quickly turned out to be a site of great cultural significance for Dubai and for the Emirates in general. It produced, from surface remains, clear evidence for quite large-scale and important deposition of artifacts from multiple periods in prehistory, with a particular focus on information from the early Iron Age. And we can see here, for example, on the surface of the site, eroding out of the dunes, large numbers of early Iron Age arrowheads mixed in with different kinds of materials, including metallurgical slag. A very rich, very important and very enigmatic archaeological site, as 20 years of work at the site has proven. In the course of those 20 years at Saruq al-Hadid, it's witnessed work by multiple teams, local teams from Dubai and the Emirates, as well as a series of international teams from Jordan, from America, from Australia, from Germany, from Poland, and from Spain as well, amongst others. So of course, as a result of this work by multiple teams over many years at the site, my talk tonight draws on evidence that was gathered by many people. And I include images of just some of those people who've been important to the study of Saruq al-Hadid on the screen here, perhaps with an emphasis towards some of the members of the Australian team that I was the director of. I'm going to draw inevitably on evidence that was recorded and captured by all of these people and more. But I in no way claim to speak on behalf of any of these people in terms of my interpretations of Saruq al-Hadid. It's a challenging site, and some of my ideas about what happened at Saruq al-Hadid and what it was like, the kind of activities that were critical there, may be very different and even divergent from other scholars who've been working at the site for a very long period as well. So this is my interpretation of some aspects of Saruq al-Hadid that nevertheless draws on collective work by very, very many people. Okay, so the first part of this talk in general, I plan to take a quick skip through the occupational sequence of the site of Saruq al-Hadid. And I'm going to begin with some of the earliest material that we have from the site, the Neolithic material. We can see some examples of Neolithic stone tools, arrowheads, and other materials on the left-hand side of the screen there. Most of these come from surface context. None have really come from excavated context unless they're in secondary context at the site. It's quite possible indeed that there may have been limited Neolithic occupation at Saruq al-Hadid, but much of this material may actually have been brought in from neighbouring Neolithic sites, which are actually quite commonplace in this particular part of the desert in Dubai. We can see very nice material from the nearby site of al-Ashush 2, which was surveyed by Jesse Cassano and his team as part of the Dubai Desert Survey. Back in the early phase of work at the site, a very large scatter of Neolithic flint remains that are found at al-Ashush 2 And indeed, some of the raw materials that were used for subsequent Bronze Age lithic industries at Saruq al-Hadid may well have derived from these earlier Neolithic sites. They're very common in the desert region of Dubai in the early part of the Holocene, and they reflect the fact that the Holocene is, in fact, the early Holocene was a climatic optimum where we see improved environmental conditions, particularly rainfall, which led to improved environments and vegetation in the desert regions, made them more accessible for different populations for a variety of practices, including hunting and herding. So it's not surprising to see relatively dense Neolithic occupation, albeit mobile occupation, around this period between 8,000 and 6,000 BC in and around Saruq al-Hadid. However, after around about 6,000 years ago, we're meant to have seen quite a dramatic change in climate and a restriction of populations back from the interior regions towards the coastal regions. We can really see the climatic change when we start to look at dune accumulation rates in the interior of the U.A.E. A really nice period in the early Holocene where dune accumulation rates are very low, but a period from about 6,000 years ago to the present where the dunes really start forming and picking up in a major way. However, it's across this period of several thousand years we continue to see very significant occupation at Saruq al-Hadid. So as a desert site, it kind of bucks the trend of this environmental determinism. We can see examples of early Bronze Age, late 4th, early 3rd millennium BC occupation at Saruq al-Hadid in terms of various kinds of material remains, most particularly fireplaces dug into the gypsum pavement. But some of the best evidence we have comes from the nearby site of al-Ashush, which has been excavated by several teams, American and Spanish. They found very interesting remains of hearths and fireplaces, as well as a very large midden of animal bones, which comes from the hunting of a variety of wild species in and around the vicinity of the site, especially wild camels and oryx and gazelle and so forth. A large midden developed from processing and eating the remains of these animals, very clearly dated to the later part of the 3rd millennium BC by a diagnostic Umunar sequence of ceramics that comes from the site. So we have evidence of this period also at Saruq al-Hadid, but certainly in the neighbourhood as well. Once we move into the very end of the 3rd millennium and through into the 2nd millennium BC, we start to see much more consistent and larger scale evidence for human occupation at the main site of Saruq al-Hadid itself. And some of the best documentation of this Bronze Age occupation sequence comes from the central sector of the site, where we were lucky enough to do some of our excavations as part of the Australian mission, alongside several other teams. Here we're able to document in relatively deep dune deposits up to 5, 6 or 7 meters deep, a series of occupations beginning with what we're calling Horizon 5, which dates to the very late 3rd or early 2nd millennium BC, followed by a series of subsequent phases, Horizon 4 from the middle 2nd millennium BC, Horizon 3 and Horizon 2, which date to the late 2nd and early 1st millennium BC, and then a very complicated Horizon 1 at the top of the site, which dates to the 1st millennium BC, as well as into much later periods as well. So broadly, we've got occupation at the site in Horizons 5 and 4 in the middle and late Bronze Ages, the Wadi Suk period and late Bronze Ages, if you prefer that terminology. And we've got very substantial early Iron Age occupation represented by Horizons 3 and 2, and also some material from Horizon 1 as well. The Bronze Age occupation at Saruq al-Hadid is very interesting, but in some ways ephemeral. It's characterized by a real emphasis on fireplaces and hearths, sometimes dug into the gypsum, sometimes dug into softer dune deposits at the site, sometimes characterized by these very dense assemblages of cooking stones, which we can see in the base of that one. We're also looking at, in the gypsum, occasionally evidence for organic structures, which would have been supported by posts. We find the post holes themselves, as you can see in this image, but the organic structures themselves have disappeared. Standing architecture is almost entirely absent from the site throughout its occupational sequence. And this is true also of the Bronze Age. The closest thing we have to standing architecture at the site is this very small mortared stone structure, which dates to Horizon 4 in the middle to late Bronze Age, which is perhaps a metre by a metre by a metre, a very small structure at the site, but nevertheless, one of the rarest ones that we have. Horizon 4 itself, you can see on the left-hand side, is characterised by a very large, deep and dense midden of animal bones left over from eating, feasting, cooking activities at the site, which took place somewhere between about 1750 and about 1300 BC, based on a quite substantial series of radiocarbon dates that we have. The study of this bone material has proven very interesting and illustrative of the kinds of activities that were taking place at the site at that time. It's clear that occupation at the site depended on the availability of water, and excavations by a variety of teams have now revealed, I think, up to about 10 wells that existed at the site. The dating of these is sometimes challenging, but it seems that many were first constructed in the Middle Bronze Age or Wadi Souq period, and then subsequently used perhaps up until the beginning or perhaps even into the early Iron Age, although determining a date of abandonment of the wells is quite challenging. Also, we have no idea of the quality of the water that might have been accessible through these wells. It's most likely to have been somewhat brackish. We can see several examples of wells in the image on the screen on the left-hand side. Also at the site, Wilkinson has recorded the possibility, for example, of perched water, that is water from rain seeping through the dunes and sitting above the desert pavement to provide one kind of source for fresh water that may have existed at the site. And a typical pattern in the historical period was Bedouin groups exploiting this region using well water or groundwater for animals because it was brackish, and perched water for fresh water for human consumption. It's likely that this amount of water may have led to increased vegetation in and around the site during its period of occupation in the Bronze Age and even into the early Iron Age. Not too far from Saruq, al-Hadid, there these days we can find stands of prosopis trees, quite substantial ones, and it may be that there was more vegetation at the site in the past. However, when we look at the archaeobotanical and zooarchaeological material, it's clear that we're not looking at an oasis or any kind of radical environmental difference from the present day to explain human occupation. It's still an arid environment at all points of settlement during the Bronze and Iron Ages. I mentioned the animal bones before. These have been studied by James Rowitz for his PhD here at U.A.E, and he did an amazing job looking at a very large assemblage of material. If we look at the examples from the Bronze Age, from horizons 5 and 4, we have many hundreds of thousands of bone fragments, and we have evidence for the presence of domesticates, sheep and goats. We also have significant evidence for hunted animals, small animals like hares and lizards, but also larger wild animals like gazelle, like Arabian oryx, and like camels, dromedaries. There are some smaller animals that may have been inhabiting the dune space, as well as evidence for bird bones of a variety of species, which may tell us something about hunting at the site. And interestingly, we're also looking at evidence for mobility, or at least contact with other environmental zones, because fish remains are also quite substantial in various phases at the site, and clearly were an important component of subsistence practices there during the Bronze Age, as well as in subsequent periods. We also learn interesting things when we look at the various plant remains from the site from the Bronze Age. This includes seeds and charcoal, as well as various studies of pollen and phytoliths, which are all still ongoing. The food remains that we have in the Bronze Age are relatively limited. Date seeds, nubk fruits, very limited evidence for cereal consumption. All of this material is probably imported to the site from a nearby oasis, or an oasis such as Hilly, or somewhere back in the Piedmont zone. We've got very interesting charcoal remains, which tell us about the kinds of fuels that were being used in the very many hearths that we have from the Bronze Age. These are invariably desert trees and shrubs like acacia, caligonum, and various other species. They're almost certainly available locally, and they tell us that we're looking at a site that was characterized by a semi-arid flora and mobile dunes. So still, even at this period of its occupation, we're looking at an environment that's not radically dissimilar to that of the present day. When we move down into the subsequent early Iron Age at the site, we start to move into horizons 2 and 1. We're getting higher in the dune sequence in the central sector of the site, but we're still looking at occupation that's characterized by very ephemeral deposits and structures. And as for the Bronze Age, we think it's still representing evidence for periodic, likely seasonal occupation of the site. We've got an image here of some of the dispersed stone that's characteristic of some of these early Iron Age deposits in the central sector of the site, which may have been used for holding down elements of organic structures, for example, during occupation. More substantial structures come from the important Spanish excavations that took place a little bit to the northeastern area 2A of the site. Again, not much in the way of standing architecture, but very significant structures of pits of various types and sizes, numerous examples of pits, which were important for a variety of pyrotechnological processes, including most likely metalworking activities. If we look further to the east at the site, in the area of the site that's currently covered by a military base, then we've got the excavations of Dubai Municipality, which have unearthed these incredible ash-rich deposits spanning a very large area, well over 100 square meters, and very deep. Ash-rich deposits which have been sitting atop a variety of pits, which look like they may have been related to charcoal production. Now, charcoal production really will have been critical for a variety of the craft activities that seem to have been taking place at the site during the early Iron Age, especially things like metal smelting, which requires charcoal as its primary fuel. Of course, as we move into the early Iron Age in horizons 3 and 2, we also see a radical change in the materiality of the site. We start to see a huge uptick in the variety of different materials and in the scale of material deposition at the site. And you can see some examples of this on the screen: ceramics, copper, iron, various kinds of precious materials in gold and gold alloys, in shell, and large concentrations of artifacts in certain parts of the site, as you can see with this assemblage of material that comes from the excavations in the military based area by DM. I mentioned at this time we also see a dramatic expansion in the evidence for craft activities. This is attested by material residues of different stages of metal production. So we've got primary slags from copper smelting that you can see towards the top of the screen here. We've got fragments of smelting furnaces, furnace walls, and other elements of the furnaces. We've got semi-processed products of those smelting operations. So that is raw copper, still full of impurities like sulfur and iron. We've got further processed copper ingots that seem to have been a major artifact type that was produced at the site in the Iron Age. We've got a huge amount of smelting, casting, refining waste or dross that we see in various parts of the site. This example comes from the Spanish excavations in area 2A. So large amounts of material attesting to the significance of copper metallurgy at the site. The early Iron Age also witnesses in what is one of the most amazing discoveries, I think, at the site, this really huge assemblage of ferrous artifacts and remains that we see from largely horizons 2 and 1. We can see the long swords of iron that were found, around a dozen of those recorded at the site, with lengths of up to 1 or 1.2 meters. But alongside those complete artifacts, we have literally thousands of fragments, broken fragments of blades, amounting to more than 200 kilograms in total of ferrous remains from the site, orders of magnitude larger than we know from contemporary sites in Southeastern Arabia. Although interestingly, the detailed study of this material by Ivan Stepanov for his PhD indicated that we've got no evidence for iron making or iron working of any sort on site at Saruq al-Hadid yet. Now, of course, this may emerge in the future, but as yet, there's no evidence for the working of this material. So this is the interesting kind of schema of the scale and chronology of metalworking that we see at Saruq al-Hadid through time. As we move from the Bronze Age into the early Iron Age, as we move into horizons 2 and 1, we start to see not just copper-based artifacts, but evidence for primary copper smelting, as well as evidence for secondary copper production, refining and casting, object manufacture and recycling. When we look in terms of the ferrous remains, we can see iron artifacts appearing perhaps as early as Horizon 3, although the stratigraphy is very challenging in this mobile dune environment, as you can imagine, certainly present in significant numbers by Horizon 2 and in the deflation deposits of Horizon 1. Certainly, as we move into the very latest periods of use at the site, into the post-Iron Age and into the early Islamic period, we're seeing some ferrous artifact deposition, but also we seem to witness a distinct phase of scavenging of the earlier ferrous remains. They're breaking up in their assessment as potential resource for metallurgy in later periods. We also see at this time evidence for precious metal artifact use in gold and gold alloys and silver, as well as a range of other metals, including lead and antimony. The evidence potentially exists also that there may have been some production of this material on site, but I'll talk about that material in more detail momentarily. So yes, in addition to large-scale metalworking activities at the site in the early Iron Age, it seems that we may have a range of other activities attested to as well. Potentially the working of precious metals like gold. We also have lots of semi-finished products in different sorts of materials. There are many hundreds of fragments of worked bone, especially seen, as in this example, in bone handles, which would have been put in the inlays of the grips of bronze and iron swords, and we have examples of those in place. We have increasing, growing evidence for the production of elaborate decorated shell discs on site, and we can see everything from shell roughouts and fragments here through to semi-finished products of shell discs. And there also seems to have been evidence for the production of beads of a variety of different materials on site as well during the Iron Age, although this can be difficult to interpret. The early Iron Age plant remains are interesting if limited. We've got absolutely no evidence for food consumption remains. This is almost certainly a sampling result. It just means we haven't dug the areas of the site where there may have been that temporary occupation and where the remains may have accrued. When we look at the charcoal, however, we've got a similar signature to what we had in the Bronze Age. Evidence for desert trees and shrubs, Caligonum, acacia, and other species, all of which would have been available locally in the desert environment. However, when we get into the early Iron Age, our plant remains expanded by having wood remains preserved from this period as well, which is very unusual for this time period in this particular part of the world. Normally all of this organic material would have simply decayed away. It's preserved probably because of the circulation of copper-rich compounds in the soil at the site. So we have hundreds and hundreds of fragmentary, largely wooden artifacts at the site. An analysis of their species provides really interesting insights into the use of this material. Much of it seems to have come from well away from the site. So while the charcoal for fires is very much local, the wood remains are very much brought to the site from distant regions, sometimes not too far away, perhaps the mountains nearby or oases and mountain wadis. Some of it may have come from the coast, but we're also looking at the occasional presence of exotic species such as ash and fir, which must have come from much further afield, either in the Eastern Mediterranean region, perhaps in the Zagros Mountains in Iran. So the wood remains are also telling us about the diversification of trade connections at the site during the early Iron Age. And indeed, when we start to look at the variety of materials that we know from the site, we can start to sketch in the early Iron Age a community that's connected, most likely indirectly, with many areas of the ancient Near East, stretching from Egypt to the southern Levant and northwestern Arabia. We also have materials that suggest connections with Assyria, with southern Mesopotamia, with Luristan, particularly in western Iran, other items which suggest connections with southeastern Iran. Closer to home, there is also material, ceramic material in particular, that comes from Bahrain. It's possible that incense was also being used at the site, although this hasn't been conclusively demonstrated. So when we look at early Iron Age Saruq al-Hadid, we're not only looking at very rich assemblage of materials, we're also looking at one which is very diverse in terms of its point of origin. At the same time as we're seeing the material expand, in terms of its richness, we're also seeing a physical expansion in the scale and scope of the site. So most of the earlier Bronze Age remains are concentrated in this central sector of the site, covering perhaps 200 by 200 meters. Once we move into the early Iron Age, we start to see material remains spread over a much larger area, at least a square kilometre and perhaps more, although I would emphasise that this occupation is very much patchy and discontinuous. It's not 1 square kilometre of continuous occupation, but it is a very wide dispersal of material at this time. By the time we get to the very latest deposits at the site in Horizon 1, we're dealing with material that is taphonomically very complicated. The action of wind and water at the site, wind in particular, has likely led to the large-scale deflation of deposits. And so what we have is upwards of 2,000 years of material dating from the early Iron Age periodically through to the early Islamic period, which are compressed down into a horizon that might be 5 or 10 centimetres thick in places. It's very challenging to pull this material apart, but we have direct radiometric dates using radiocarbon and thermoluminescence, which tell us that we have got materials from different periods. As I mentioned before, we've got lots of fragmented iron remains from Horizon 1, evidence of materials like this longsword being processed to try and assess their metal content as part of scavenging and recycling activities. When this happened, whether it was post-Iron Age or late pre-Islamic or early Islamic, is very difficult to determine. Typologically, we've got other metal remains from the site, or metallurgical remains from the site rather, such as this very big tap slag, which typologically look very much like early Islamic examples that we know from elsewhere in Southeastern Arabia. So we've got some material indicators that tell us that there was post-Iron Age and early Islamic occupation at the site to match onto the radiometric dates that we have. All in all, based on this evidence for occupation from the Neolithic period through into the early Islamic period, albeit occupation that was perhaps seasonal and inconsistent, we tend to think of Saruq al-Hadid as what we're calling a persistent place, a term that's quite widespread in archaeology now to capture this idea of a site that's returned to again and again and again over a period of hundreds or thousands of years, and which in the course of that persistence accrues meaning and significance that it might not otherwise have had. And so part of the aspect of exploring the cultic dimension of Saruq al-Hadid is assessing this aspect of its existence as a persistent place in the landscape that was culturally created and became increasingly culturally significant through time. Okay, I've used this word cultic a fair bit. And in this section, the second part of the talk, really what I want to do is explore what elements of the archaeological material that we have from Saruq al-Hadid we might actually regard as cultic. And I'll tell you right now, the answer is I'm not sure. But let's look at some of the characteristics that might define cultic at the site. But before we get there, I'll take a little detour. What we seem to have documented, and what many discussions of Saruq al-Hadid focus on, is a transition as we move through occupation of the site from a focus in the Bronze Age that was largely subsistence-based. We've got all that evidence for hunting and consumption of animals, through to a focus on large-scale craft production, especially metallurgy, by the time we move to the Iron Age, although it's not just metallurgy. We've got evidence for copper production, but there may also have been hide working, the working of precious metals, shells, bone, wood. We know that iron wasn't being worked at the site, or at least there's no evidence for it thus far. But it does seem to be a very important aspect of the early Iron Age occupation of the site is craft production. At the same time as we're seeing this transition, we're seeing a dramatic diversification of the subsistence base and the raw material sources, particularly, that are available to the occupants of Saruq al-Hadid. And alongside this transition, we also see an elaboration, a very large-scale elaboration of what we might call the ritual component of the site, which we would characterize by cultic artifacts and by depositional contexts and materials that we would call votives or offerings or sacrificial offerings or these kind of things. The terminology can be a little bit difficult. but much of the material record of the site seems to be made up of artifacts that were deliberately left behind and deposited at the site in ritual or cultic contexts. Now, ritual and religion is notoriously difficult to get at from the archaeological record when you don't have any written testament to past beliefs. This was captured by Hawkes in his Ladder of Inference, which is reframed by Clive Gamble as an onion rather than a ladder, whereby each peel brings tears to your eyes as you realize what was lost because it wasn't written down. And right at the center of that onion, generating the most tears of all, are religious institutions and spiritual life, and the challenge that they represent to archaeologists to try and understand them just from their material remains. And in addition to this challenge of trying to understand these complex belief systems, we also have a series of terms that are very complex to define, and that each of which has a whole lot of baggage in terms of our modern understanding and conception of what the term might be. So terms like cult, ritual, religion, and magic all have a place in our discussion of what people were doing at Saruq al-Hadid in the past. However, capturing the differences between these terms and using them in ways which are consistent is really challenging. So what I would say at the start of this discussion about cultic elements at Saruq al-Hadid is that a cultic site, at least how I'm using the term and how it's been used in the discussion of these sites, is one where there's a concentration of material evidence related to religious rituals. Now, each of those terms needs more unpacking. We can do that in question time if you want. So in terms of the overwhelming nature of some of the cultic iconography at Saruq al-Hadid, again, like many other sites in the region, which I'll talk about in the third part of this talk, we've got an emphasis on the use of the image of the snake, the iconography of the snake. And this is in a variety of different kinds of materials. We see it in ceramic on different sorts of vessels. We see it in metals in terms of snake figurines, in both bronze and occasionally in gold as well, as you can see on the upper left-hand side of the screen. Examples of this sort of imagery are redolent. I think there are more than 600 odd snake figurines themselves that have been excavated from the site across all missions. So this sort of imagery is what first indicated or suggested that cultic activities were a critical component of human occupation at Saruq al-Hadid. In addition, more recent excavations at the site, in particular in Area 2A by the Spanish team, excuse me, have brought to light some fascinating remains which would typically be interpreted as evidence for cultic practices. We've got these amazing anthropomorphic figurines that you can see on the right-hand side, interestingly, intimately associated with evidence for metal production and extraction in this particular part of the site, and beautifully mapped there on the left-hand side of the screen. In addition to the anthropomorphic figures, we also have zoomorphic figurines, that is animals other than snakes, being shown as well. And you can see this very small gold figurine on the upper left-hand side of the screen, which is also present at the site. So we've got different varieties of religious, of cultic imagery being employed at the site. The traditionally known stuff, the snake imagery, but also new elements like these anthropomorphic figurines. There's also a range of what we might call cultic paraphernalia. These are items that are typically found on other sites identified as cultic in Southeastern Arabia. I'll talk more about them later. And not found in significant numbers or at all on sites which have a more mundane interpretation. So these pedestaled vessels or braziers or incense burners, as they've been called by various authors, clearly seem to be related to a subset of activities that's happening at Saruq al-Hadid, and I think very strongly belong in that cultic sphere of activity at the site. But a big question that we have, given so much material is deposited at the site, is how we might identify sacrificial offerings or votive offerings at Saruq al-Hadid, and how we might differentiate those from material deposited in more mundane contexts. This raises the question of whether we can really differentiate the sacred and the profane at a site like Saruq al-Hadid or in a society like early Iron Age society in Southeastern Arabia. Probably not. I would suggest that our Western epistemologies and their dualistic conception of the sacred and profane probably don't do a very good job of capturing the way that these religious beliefs permeated all aspects of society and behaviour at a site like Saruq al-Hadid. However, if we're trying to differentiate material that may have been deposited in ritual contexts at Saruq, I think there's a number of aspects that we consider, and these might help us to identify votive materials or sacrificial offerings at the site. The first factor is their manufacture from exotic or precious materials. This is common for votive offerings, known cross-culturally in many contexts. Another thing that tends to differentiate, to my mind, votive offerings is that people are playing with scale, and they're playing with scale mostly through miniaturizing artifacts and presenting much smaller scale items in lieu of the much larger ones that would have been used in daily life. Again, another typical feature of sites which witness these kind of votive offerings. I think there are certain subjects and iconography we've seen already in the case of snakes that seem to be really part of the ritual iconographical sphere of early Iron Age society, and we'll look at some of those. I think that people didn't just play with scale, they also played with material. So we see skeuomorphs of artifacts that are typically made of one material being made of a different material, one which would be non-functional on a day-to-day basis, but which might imply some sort of value in a ritual or cultic context. And there are a couple of other categories which are a bit more difficult or problematic, but which I think at Saruq still relate to sacrificial offerings and votive depositions. And one of these is broken or scrap materials. Now, in many contexts archaeologically around the world, votive deposits and special deposits, structured deposits can be very heavily composed of broken or scrap materials. But when you start to look at a site which is important for metallurgical production, then this material might also be more mundane day-to-day residues of these sorts of craft activities. The same goes for the presence at Saruq al-Hadid of unfinished or incomplete objects, which might just have been stopped at a particular point in the production process. Or to my mind, some of these were deliberately selected because they were unfinished and incomplete for as offerings or votives to be deposited at the site. Okay, so I'm going to talk through some examples of this. The exotic and or precious materials, I guess, pretty much speak for themselves. We're looking at a bunch of gold. We're looking at iron, which almost certainly was brought into the region from outside. Our analyses suggest that this came probably from Iran, although other regions are possible. We've got various kinds of ceramics, which we know come from different parts of Iran. We've got very elaborately carved and beautiful shell materials. So although the shell material itself may be comparatively local, the incredible amount of work that's gone into these makes them a different category of material that has very precious characteristics. Also, we have other kinds of items which are very elaborately cast, like these daggers with feline handles on the left-hand side of the screen. They're probably imports, although that's not entirely certain. But we do know that the raw materials that they're made from, in this case, ferrous blades and tin bronze handles, do most certainly include exotic alloy materials. So this is the sort of stuff that's not particularly surprising for votive deposits. We also have thematically some subjects. I've mentioned snake iconography already, but clearly archery and archery related materials are very commonly associated with cultic deposits across Southeastern Arabia, and we'll explore this more in a moment. At Saruq, we've got quivers of arrows. We've got more than 10,000 individual arrowheads found at the site in various deposits. We've got wooden shafts, often of olive wood, which seem most likely to represent the shafts of arrows that were deposited at the site. In terms of playing with materials and creating skeuomorphs, we have this beautiful example from Saruq of a complete arrow, the tip, the shaft, and the fletching, which is made in copper or copper alloy, clearly non-functional, but suitable for deposition within a cultic context. In addition, we've got other skeuomorphs. We've got these lovely bone arrowheads or points. Now, these are somewhat more challenging to identify as skeuomorphs. They may well have been totally functional in their own right as artifacts. However, given what is being played with material-wise at the site, I think we could also consider this an example of skeuomorphism for the purposes of ritual deposition. Playing with scale, miniaturization is really one of the most obvious and commonplace elements of, I think, ritual manipulations that were taking place at Saruq al-Hadid. Here's an image produced by Helene David-Cuny, who has summarised in one image very nicely the difference in scale of daggers that we see at the site, and miniatures are very much present in the assemblage at the site in substantial numbers, although of varying scales in comparison to the original. We see this also in the case of miniature bows, which are found at the site. These are not only miniaturized, but they're also skeuomorphs, as they're made of different materials like bronze. They're also made of precious materials like gold. So we can see that these different categories that relate to ritual deposition often cross-cut. And we can see that one artifact might have multiple elements of these features which characterize ritual deposition. These examples all come from the Spanish excavations in Area 2A, a beautiful concentration of material right there. And also this category of what I'm calling unfinished objects. So we've seen already some of the shells, we've seen semi-finished shells, decorated through to smoothly polished, and we've seen finished artifacts there as well. We also see this in bronze. For example, we've got this wonderful axe from Saruq al-Hadid, an axe head, which still has the pouring cup from the casting and the flashing from the casting process, the metal that seeped between the two parts of the bivalve mold as it was solidifying. These are still preserved on that artifact. We have these wonderful arrowheads, which are showing how they were cast together. Now, many of these could have been made and simply cut apart, but we have these artifacts deposited still in their semi-finished state. Now, a reason that I think this may be related to ritual or cultic activities as opposed to just metallurgical production is that we have very similar material in this wonderful axe from the site of Jebel Mudmar, excavated by the French team there, which shows all of these features. It's a semi-finished object, but they're deposited in what is very clearly a ritual context within a particular building at Jebel Mudmar, alongside a whole series of other miniaturized and skeuomorphed kinds of materials as well. So I think we can see this unfinishedness as an aspect of some materials that are chosen for ritual deposition. And finally, we've got this very challenging collection of material of broken objects or scrap material, which is very common at Saruq al-Hadid. Scrap bronze, scrap gold. We see broken materials in stone. Now, it's clear that some of these may have been the unwanted or the abandoned or stored residues of production processes. But it's unusual to find quite so much even at metallurgical production sites, and it's certainly unusual to find large amounts of scrap precious metals, even at precious metal production sites. And so it's probably reasonable in my mind to consider some of this material at least as sacrificial offerings, just like other artifact types at the site. So we can start to see that we have, with these different characteristics, a constellation of attributes that make for suitable votive artifacts at the site. Precious materials, miniatures, particular iconographic forms and types, skeuomorphic creation of materials, broken and scrap materials, as well as unfinished and incomplete artifacts. And I think all in all, we can look, if we use this lens, at many of the materials that were deposited at Saruq al-Hadid having some kind of an element of cultic or ritual deposition behind them, and challenging this idea of a strict breakdown between spheres of activity such as crafting and religious or cultic activity. Clearly, there's a great deal of intersection and overlap in these processes. As a side point, it's interesting to me to note that in terms of many of these characteristics, aside from the use of exotic or precious materials, Not many of these characteristics characterize the artifacts that we might find in burial contexts in Southeastern Arabia, although this is something that needs much more scrutiny. And it certainly suggests to me that there are different realms of ritual and cultic activity that are associated with their own appropriate behaviours and iconographies, and even aspects of cosmology as well. So I think we can start to explore these a little further down the track. All in all, we've tried in our writings about Saruq al-Hadid to bring together some of these different aspects under the heading of Arabian pilgrimage, drawing heavily on Joy McCorrison's ideas of exactly what pilgrimage might be. She called it a constellation of gathering, sacrifice, and feasting at a sacred place to assemble and reify communities that are not co-resident. And we think some of these pilgrimage aspects capture quite nicely the diversity of activities that's happening at Saruq al-Hadid. It may be about forging social networks between mobile and sedentary groups, but we also see disparate sedentary communities as being brought together at the site in the early Iron Age to engage in a whole variety of different kinds of activities. And in fact, I think these activities might well draw on Saruq al-Hadid's persistence in the landscape and its earlier periods of occupation. If I could draw an example, go back to the Bronze Age deposits at the site, I would suggest that the dense bone midden that we have there of animal bones might well reflect ritual hunting. We know that in northwestern Arabia in the late Bronze and early Iron Age, and in southern Arabia in the first millennium BC, in very different cultural contexts that were characterized by very different levels of social complexity, hunting nevertheless played a key role in consolidating leadership. It occurred at different points and places in time, commemorated different kinds of events. As Manuel Tebas says in this, it served to coalesce and perpetuate the amalgamation of different parts of Southern Arabian desert polities. Now, it may be a stretch to see this kind of thing in big rubbish dumps, but this is far from an unusual archaeological interpretation. If we can stretch our parallels much further afield and consider a site like Chaco Canyon in the Americas, their massive garbage middens have been regarded as symbolizing largesse, prosperity, hospitality, and served as material signifiers of past festivals and conspicuous consumption. They were interpreted as forging enduring memories and powerful experiences of place. And I think that what's happening in Saruq in the Iron Age can't be divorced from what may have been happening at the site earlier during the Wadi Souq and the late Bronze Age, drawing on this idea of a persistent place. Okay, I'm going to finish off with just a very quick review of how the evidence from Saruq fits into what we know from other cultic sites in Southeastern Arabia. This all began, I guess, back in the 70s with Munir Taha's excavations at the site of al-Qasais, which for a very long time was isolated as one of the few or the only potentially cultic site that we might know in the region. Of course, it was famous for the mound of serpents and the bronze serpent or snake figurines that came from the site, but many other elements of its material culture, ceramic materials with snake decoration, a preponderance of arrowheads being deposited as votives or sacrificial offerings, obviously set the template for what was to be discovered later on. However, it really wasn't until the last 20 years that a series of excavations by teams at Masafi, at Bithna, at Saruq al-Hadid itself, at Salut, and Jebel Mudma in Oman have given us a much broader range of potentially cultic sites, all of which fall into this early Iron Age period in Southeastern Arabia. And in fact, they're just part of a much broader set of sites which show evidence for more or less use of snake imagery in the early Iron Age. You can see those marked by triangles on the map here on the left-hand side of the screen. And again, here's just some of the evidence that comes from the sites of Jebel Mudma, Salut, and Masafi. The significance of these sites was recognised very early on, particularly by Anne Benoit and colleagues who were involved in the excavations or directed the excavations at sites like Bithna in Fujairah, which produced this incredible assemblage of cultic materials, including architectural features that may well represent a serpent and which are associated with metal smelting. Further work at Bithna and Masafi published in a variety of papers, has served to highlight different cross-cutting aspects of ritual practices in the early Iron Age, an association between snakes and copper and water, which is very apparent at a series of sites like Saruq, al-Hadid, Bithna and Masafi. This topic has also been the subject of a couple of master's dissertations as well by Tracy Cian and Anna de las Cias at various institutions. So it's a deeply researched topic, but it's one where the evidence is changing quite rapidly. And indeed, if we look at this conception of snake, copper and water being related in the cult and rituals of the region, as we look at emerging evidence from sites like Saruq al-Hadid and Jabal Mudmar, I think we can add multiple new elements to these associations, although the associations might well be polythetic. That is, that elements of ritual observation in the early Iron Age incorporate many of these elements, but not necessarily all of them. None is particularly necessary or essential. I think the recent excavations at Jabal Mudmar have been particularly important in demonstrating and consolidating this picture of the nature of early Iron Age cultic practices, particularly the association with snakes and archery and other kinds of cultic paraphernalia. They see this site as a meeting centre for nomadic and sedentary populations. And it's clear that that meeting involved a whole bunch of ritual actions. More than 4,000 arrowheads have come from the recent excavations at this site. So really honing on this relationship between cultic practices and archery, which is materialized through a whole bunch of miniatures and skeuomorphs at the site, found in amazing numbers and beautiful representations of different kinds of materials. So Jabal Mudmar is really highlighting this material. Other sites like Salut also help us to introduce us to different kinds of cultic paraphernalia and processes which were taking place. If I could use this evidence to quickly take a second look at a site like Uqdat al-Bakra, I think the evidence that we're beginning to assemble from cultic sites can be quite important in reinterpreting or re-emphasizing different aspects of interpretation of sites that have been known for a while. Uqdat al-Bakra, out in the desert at the end of Wadi Dunk, is a kind of site that proved that Saruq al-Hadid wasn't unique. It has many of the similar elements of Saruq al-Hadid, including lots of evidence for pyrotechnological installations and metallurgical production. A really important and critical and fundamental site. It also has a little bit of evidence for some of the typical elements of cultic practice in the early Iron Age, especially snake figurines. However, I would suggest that Guillaume and Paul's interpretation of this site has de-emphasized this cultic component and focused on a more utilitarian interpretation as a metal production site in the desert. Now, absolutely, that's really critical and useful. However, I think when you start to look at the material remains from Uqdat al-Bakra, you can spot many of the elements that we've seen already at Saruq al-Hadid and at Jabal Mudmar. There are miniatures of different metal forms like these daggers. There are miniature axes, although they're interpreted tentatively as stakes at the site. I think they're miniatures of axes, and they map very well onto what we know from other sites. We also have deposition of unfinished artifacts like this axe, which we've already seen beautiful parallels from Saruq al-Hadid. And these are also found unfinished artifacts in miniatures. So again, cross-cutting all of these categories. Interestingly enough, the radiocarbon dates that we have on pits from Uqdat al-Bakra that are published all fall before the Iron Age, whereas most of the metal artifacts clearly date to the early Iron Age. And it seems to me that Uqdat al-Bakra is another site that draws its significance on being a persistent place and on the presence of this earlier occupation. So a little summary then of Saruq al-Hadid in relation to some of the other cultic sites in the region that we know, although there's much more that could be and should be said on this topic. If I can finish off just quickly, I would say in general, when we're looking at cult sites in Southeastern Arabia, they've really emerged over the course of the last 20 years as a significant phenomenon in early Iron Age society in the region, a phenomenon that really deserves scrutiny and attention, as challenging as it is to interpret. We can see as more and more evidence comes to light that the material components of these cultic rituals are varied by site, by context, but they share elements of a growing list of common elements. Now, as the studies that have been done to date demonstrate, reconstructing cosmological ideas and beliefs out of this material is an extraordinarily difficult process. However, cultic practice and ritual practice opens up many avenues for future research. We can explore the intensified material, sensual, and emotional experiences generated by these cultic rituals. We can also, of course, use ritual as a window in to understanding with and grappling with the capacity of rituals to tell us about placemaking, ritual landscapes, negotiation of power and social action, economy through the creation of ritual economies, and a wide variety of other processes, especially when we look at both sacred and profane ritual action. So I think that the opportunity for further research and understanding is enormous based on this growing body of material. And as I've well extended over my time, I think I'm going to stop there and thank you for your attention this evening.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. It was a very, very beautiful conference, and you are very generous with us and with our sharing first many data and many of your very rich and complex ideas about the sites and how the sites of Saruq al-Hadid integrates a more general picture of this ritual Iron Age landscape we begin to see for Southeastern Arabia. And also I appreciated, and I think every of us appreciate very much, that you discuss in details the parallels and comparisons with the contemporary sites. And we have here several people who may ask general questions, but also more detailed questions. So we would be very happy, Marc and Marc Lebeau and Guillaume Jeannès and I, if the audience ask questions, and after the questions of the people of the audience, I am sure Guillaume will have some detailed question. And before I give the micro, if I can say that, I would like also say that the way you worked in your team, especially with Hélène, David Kenny, it's really research with the question of the drawings and photos, and since years, and it opens a very large avenue for the future of archaeology, I think, not only in Eastern Arabia. And luckily, Hélène is involved into a number of archaeological excavations, but with you and the other members of your team in Saruq al-Hadid, this dialogue is extremely fruitful, I guess. Okay, so who would like to ask a question or make a comment? Alors, Dr. Tracy Xian would like to make a comment. So Guillaume, would you mind to open the audio of the audience, please?
I think, Sophie, that Tracy has said that her microphone isn't working, so that's why she's written her
I know.
question.
So I ask Guillaume to open the microphones of the audience. I can't do that.
While we work with the technical details, I'm happy to answer Tracy's question as she's written it down.
So what? Tracy, could you write again your question? into the discussion box, so Lloyd will be able to answer.
That's okay, Sophie. I can see the question.
Okay.
Tracy's asked about other animal representations that have been found at Saruq al-Hadid. We have examples of fish, I guess, fish depicted in a variety of metal objects. In addition to the snakes, of course, there's fish. What else do we have? We've got undefined animals, that small little quadruped kind of a figure that I showed you. Not vast numbers, I would say. If we start to look at the, I guess, a few score seals that were found at the site, we have maybe some more depictions of animals there as well, although they can be challenging to interpret. It looks like some might be oryx or gazelle. We might have a camel depicted there as well. So the snake is certainly the dominant animal depicted, but others are known as well. And the fish is quite interesting because it's also reported from a few other cultic contexts as well. It's a particular kind of fish or species of fish. I think James Roberts is in the audience and may be able to answer us or write down what particular kind of fish it was. He knows the details.
Off the top of my head, I can't remember, but I do remember the number of fins are important. We chased it down for a while, and we were able to identify it as species, but I will have to get back to you on that, Tracy.
Yeah,
sure.
Maybe you could drop Tracy a line, James. Thanks.
Yeah, I will do.
Okay. I was wondering, would you tell us a little bit about your today hypothesis about the place of Saruq al-Hadid into the general configuration of these ritual sites? Because we know normally they integrate settlement sites. We have the examples of Bithna and Mazafi and even Mudma, but of course, Saruq al-Hadid is very special, that's for sure. Why?
Well, I guess it probably wasn't in consciousness that these kind of sites might exist out in the desert, at least amongst the archaeologists who are by and large working in Southeastern Arabia for the last 30, 40, 50 years or so. So the discovery of the site was quite surprising and it was quite unexpected, and it suggested a kind of landscape exploitation pattern that was a little bit different. And beautifully, not long after the discovery of Uqdat al-Bakra demonstrated that Saruq al-Hadid wasn't unique. It was just another example of a particular kind of site that fitted more broadly into the settlement system. I think the site's important partly because it's liminal and it's distant from most of the loci of permanent settlement. I think it's important because it's only occupied periodically. And I think it's important because like many of the sedentary sites that we know, it had a long period of human occupation and use and was part of the cultural memory and cultural capital of early Iron Age communities in the region. You know, it's just, you know, that line from Shakespeare, there's more in the world than dreamt of in our philosophies. Well, until Saruq al-Hadid was discovered, we hadn't really thought about the potential for the desert to have been integrated into this settlement system. And Saruq's important because I think it helps to bring that element of the landscape in with the remainder of early Iron Age sites that we know. Does that help to answer something about what you're talking about or you were asking about?
Yeah, also the fact that I, with other scholars, especially Stephen Karachik, I contributed a little bit to your huge project regarding the petrography of and the chemistry of some sample of pottery. And which is extraordinary is that we really can argue and demonstrate the reality of the exchange of pottery, of local and regional pottery, coming from the Northern Emirates, from Al-Ain, and also from, most probably from Oman as well. And it converges to Saruq al-Hadid. So we not only have the demonstration of the arrival of fancy prestige goods coming from far away, from outside, but also from the local networks. What do you think now about other types of artifacts other than pottery artifacts in this sense, and also other than metallic ones, because you talked about the metallic ones. No?
Yeah, sure. I think part of the story of the deposition of these artifacts at Saruq al-Hadid, probably an aspect which I didn't emphasize, but maybe needs to be considered more, is what we might call object biographies. And you're absolutely right that your study with Steve of the ceramics and with Steve and Anne did demonstrate that the materials that were getting deposited, the ceramic materials at Saruq, had different stories to tell. They'd come from different places. And so that was perhaps part of what was significant about their deposition at the site. If we look at different materials, okay, you don't want me to talk about metals. The shell artifacts, I find them particularly complicated and fascinating materials, because superficially, all of that raw material could be relatively local, although it must be coastal rather than anywhere adjacent to Saruq al-Hadid itself, whether that's the Persian Gulf or whether that's the Gulf of Oman or further afield. But it all could be comparatively local. But when you look at the iconography and the carving that is on those seals, it's very diverse, and it displays iconographic connections that with very distant regions as far away as the Assyrian world. So again, I think if you start pulling apart raw material sources and iconographic influences, you start to be able to tell a very interesting story about the potential biography of those pieces and what they meant to the individuals who owned them and left them at the site. So you could look across all of different categories of material and I think start to tell stories like that about what was put into the ground at Saruq al-Hadid. And from that, you could start to, I guess, draw a long bow and start to talk more about the significance for the cultic and ritual activities that were taking place there. It's a great point, Sophie. Thank you.
And I would like also, because Romolo Loreto is here and he was part of the jury of the PhD of Maria Paola Pellegrino a few weeks ago in Paris. And Maria Paola worked on the question of the early Bronze Age pottery in the northern U.A.E. And she discovered and demonstrated that I mean, there are many elements coming from early Bronze Age into the Iron Age, and then the pending question of the Iron Age 1 now has to be totally reconsidered, and the real Iron Age is what we called before the Iron Age 2 and 3 locally. And regarding the pottery analysis, it is now very clear that all these exchanges for the pottery exists before the Iron Age and are already very coherent. So what do you mean about that? Do you have elements pro or against this vision of this work, this very recent work on EBA material from the Northern Emirates and comparanda with other sites? Lloyd?
I'm not sure if I caught the question in there, Sophie, about whether the Iron Age distribution patterns map onto the early Bronze Age.
No, it was about the continuity of the exchange network between EBA and the Iron Age, the local exchange networks.
Yeah, I don't know. I tend to see the second millennium as characterized by a bit more what we would consider regionalism rather than integration. I think you start to see perhaps somewhat different social and cultural trajectories in more northerly versus more southerly parts of Southeastern Arabia. And in particular, I think the Northern Emirates, that part of and into the Musandam, really differentiates itself from what's happening in other parts of Southeastern Arabia. So I would suspect that that represents something of a breakdown in a more integrated early Bronze Age picture that you're describing. And that rather than continuity, the early Iron Age might represent a revival of those earlier interconnections as settlement grew dramatically over the course of the late second and early first millennium.
Okay.
Well, hello everybody. There are plenty of questions in the written question from Marta Luciani first. Hi, Marta.
Do you want to ask you a question, Marta? I can read it in the text at the side. I see you asked whether hunting was the main reason for seeking out the site in the Bronze Age. I think yes and no. Yes, because clearly the main activity they were engaged in, we see in material terms, was hunting. But the side effect or the purpose of hunting is to catch that material. And I think the social aspect of the feasting that followed on was probably incredibly critical. So whether that's a sort of chicken and egg question, which is more important, the hunting or the feasting, you can't have one without the other. But clearly, I think that social element to the site was really critical during the Bronze Age. Does that help to answer your question? We're not sure if we have Marta still online.
I don't know. The discussion is great.
Can I then agree very strongly with Helene that she was critical to our work at Saruq al-Hadid, which is the next comment in line. In fact, she was probably the most critical person in the entire project in terms of how we managed to build and maintain a relationship and demonstrate the value of the work that we were doing. So thanks, Helene.
She's very French. Okay, and I personally...
There are other questions, Sophie. Sophie, sorry to interrupt. There are plenty of other questions from Susanna and Christina. So also written question, Lloyd, if you have access to them.
Yes, I can see them in the side. Thanks, Guillaume. Zhuzhana, you have asked a question about Uqdat al-Bakra, suggesting that Uqdat perhaps seems to be less complex, no gold working, beads, seals, and bones. Yeah, there is a difference, absolutely a difference. But I wonder, we've got people in the audience like Seppi Lena, who've worked at both sites. I'm not sure who else is there. Francesco Genki is also there. Perhaps they'd like to come into the conversation at this point. It's difficult for me to assess relative complexity. They just seem to have many elements that overlap. But happy to open it up to conversation.
But about Uqdat al-Bakra, if I may, I know this site quite well also, and definitely the main difference is there about the material. It's 99% copper or bronze objects, no pottery. For instance, there is one sherd only that have been discovered on the site, which should indicate a major difference if we compare to Saruq al-Hadid, to Bithna, and even to Mudmar or Salut. So probably there is something with the site. But you're true. Paul is not here, so I cannot talk. But I think a discussion have to be proposed about this topic.
I mean, I was interested, Guillaume, in what you think about this idea that there is more to Uqdat al-Bakra than simply metal production. I mean, whether you think of it as ritual or cult or magic that's associated with metallurgical activities, how do you interpret the miniatures and those sorts of things at Uqdat al-Bakra?
It's difficult to find interpretation because according to data, there is few evidences. Of course, you indicate those miniatures objects, the unfinished object, and so these categories fit into your model, and that's absolutely right. But it's we have to consider also that those kind of objects have to be produced somewhere, and it could be the place for production of cultic objects. By the way, it could also be a part of a complex ritual society with a place devoted to the production and the specific production of cultic objects. Why not? But also there are some kind of objects, for instance, hoods, that could also be normal tools. For this reason, maybe it's a multi-purpose production site. A part could be a ritual object, another part could be a normal object.
Yeah. But which is which? Can you draw a line very easily between a ritual object and one that's everyday?
Okay, let's make this study.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the challenge and part of the interest in trying to explore these sites. I see there's a question from Christina about the huts and the post holes from the Bronze Age layers. I can't remember their dimensions off the top of my head. There are lots of them, and some of the arrangements are very challenging to interpret. Some of them are really very clear. Are they residential units? Again, there's very little material that's associated with them. Beyond the post holes themselves, we get a little bit at the very bottom of our Horizon 5 deposits, but it's small scale material, some hards and so forth, which suggest the kind of activities that we're seeing also in upper deposits. So yes, I think some of them are almost certainly related to human occupation. Some may serve other purposes, temporary penning of animals, for example. As we know, there are domesticates being taken to the site as well. Very challenging to interpret, and I think it's an aspect of the site that we need to spend a bit more time on, and it's one where integrating the results from multiple teams' work will be really important in getting a broader picture and map of the post holes and getting some idea of whether we can look at discrete residential units or even composite units at the site. Did that answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Christina.
Hi.
There is also a question of Romolo about wells. Did you answer that one?
I can, but only with secondhand knowledge. So our team didn't dig any wells, no wells in the areas that we worked on. So all I'm relying on is what I've read and heard from other teams' reports and from conversations at the site. The dating of the wells is, from what I understand it, challenging, although the evidence that I've heard points to their digging in the Wadi Souq period or late Bronze Age, and them being out of use, I guess, by the early Iron Age. When in the early Iron Age is a question, it's quite a long period. I think they were an incredibly important and attractive marker for the site during that particular period of occupation. Regardless of whether they provided particularly pure drinking water or not, they certainly would have helped with herd animals. And clearly water was critical to the use of the site throughout its occupation. I don't have much more to say, simply through lacking direct experience working with any of those wells.
Thank you, Lloyd.
I'm not sure if there's anyone else here from the other teams who may have excavated wells who might have wanted to jump in there, but it's a complicated issue, but a really interesting one. There's 10 of them in a big long line at the site during that second millennium period. So clearly critical.
Lloyd,
Francesco has a question.
Sorry?
Francesco have a question about the connection between the funerary and the funerary and the cultic. About the link, that if you have ideas about this connection that exists.
Okay, Francesco points out that there are many shared materials in the funerary contexts at Dhabi. and in Saruq al-Hadid. I agree, many different categories of materials are there. What I tried to do in the talk was highlight some that seem uncommon in burials, if not entirely not present. So it's news to me that there are snake motifs painted on a jar that's exhibited in the museum. So that's really interesting, because examples of the snake motif in funerary context are very, very rare. And I know it was thought that that might have been the case at Al-Qusais, but all of the snake imagery comes from a totally different part of the site, with a different chronology than certainly many of the tombs there, and the snake imagery just isn't a part of those burial assemblages there. So it's interesting to me that it is. I expect that there are different kinds of iconographies associated with these different spheres of ritual activity, but overlap is certainly going to be there, and assessing that clearly is a major aspect of research going forward. What do you think, Francesco?
Francesco, you may easily reactivate your microphone yourself.
It's a thumbs up from Francesco.
Are you here, Francesco? Maybe it disappeared.
It's a very long conversation to work this out, but I think it's just the start of trying to really break down these complex ritual spheres of action. I mean, we've talked about Saruq. Francesco has mentioned Dhabi and the ritual realm. So much has been written, so much great stuff by Anne Benoit and by Peter McGee about ritual activity in columned halls and special delineated buildings within settlements at archaeological sites, and how they may have been important in different kinds of social negotiations and power relations and all of those sorts of things. So what we've got is a series of cross-cutting ritual activities, which will intersect in various interesting ways, I guess.
Okay. Any other question of comment or comments from?
Oh, only one comment, if I may. Lloyd, do you? I'm sure you do, but do you know the site, the Iranian site of Samtarashan?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So you
Yeah.
observed some similarities, probably.
Yeah, I've written a paper recently on connections between Iran and Arabia in the Iron Age. It builds on so much work that has already been done by people like Peter McGee. But you're absolutely right. Samtarashan provides all sorts of parallels to this very large-scale deposition of metal in cultic context. Typologically, a lot of that material has great parallels with the Arabian material. In terms of archaeological context, there are similarities. And there are other similarities in that both sites are really hard to understand. But it's a great point. Yeah, very good connections.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you're interested, Guillaume, there's also evidence for snake figurines in southeastern Iran, which probably date to the early Iron Age. So they're the first suggestion that we have for elements of this cultic paraphernalia or iconography spreading across the Strait of Hormuz into the Jiroft region. So that's also quite interesting.
Great, thank you. Is there any other comment or remark or question?
Okay, so we maybe may close the discussion, and thank again very, very much Lloyd for this this paper. All was registered, so it will be certainly shared and appreciated by other people. Would you, Guillaume, make a small point about the next conference?
Yeah, if my memory is okay. Next presentation will be exactly after 4 weeks It will be the 9th March, and it will be a talk by Bruno Overlate. So I don't have the topic, but it's probably just the period after our early Iron Age, but the pre-Islamic period. So it will be very fascinating too. Thank you so much, Lloyd. Thank you, Sophie.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sophie. Thanks, Guillaume. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much, and see you very soon.
Bye.
Bye.
Have a nice day. Have a nice night, Lloyd.
Thank you.
Bye.
You too.
Bye.